Hi there, I am a beginning archaeology student and I am playing a totally legal archaeology adventure by Exponential Productions to see how accurately this game reflects what archaeology actually is and whether I could connect what happens in the game to concepts I've learned throughout this semester. When we begin, we play as a museum manager and archaeologist as well, and your job is to excavate artifacts and add them to your museum for display. And from the title alone, you'll see that the game is intentionally satire. A quote unquote totally legal archaeology adventure immediately hints that what you're about to do is really not how archaeology works. In real life, archaeology is not wandering onto a patch of land, digging things up, and placing them into a private museum for profit. Here you'll see that the first excavation area is literally right behind the museum, and you'll also see these skeletons that are clearly not human, and that's another issue entirely. That while archaeologists do study animal remains, that work technically falls under zoo archaeology, and it's used to understand diet, environment, or human-animal relationships. Archaeology is about understanding people, and animal remains only matter as much as they can help us understand human behavior. So you start digging almost immediately without any background research or preparation, and this skips a major step in archaeological practice, which is survey. In real archaeology, excavation is usually the last step and not the first. Archaeologists begin with survey methods to understand what's on the landscape before disturbing it. These can include non-invasive techniques like surface survey, aerial photography, or ground-penetrating radar. Survey helps archaeologists identify patterns and choose excavation locations carefully and minimize damage to the site. By skipping survey entirely, the game is reinforcing a common misconception that archaeology is just about digging, but in reality, excavation is very destructive because once you dig, you can't put the site back the way it was, and that's why archaeologists are extremely cautious about where and how they excavate. This ties into a broader issue referred to as archaeology's vision problem. Popular media consistently misrepresents archaeology and what it's about. When most people think of archaeology, they kind of imagine Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider or treasure hunters. These portrayals are fantastical and emphasize adventure, but ignore the reality of archaeology that is careful methodology, long hours of documentation, and ethical responsibility. The game, while clearly fictional, still reflects this same vision problem. The core gameplay loop involves digging up objects, cleaning them, and then immediately displaying them. And this process strips artifacts of their most important quality, which is context. In real archaeology, an artifact's value comes from its provenience, which is its 3D location, its association with other finds, and its stratigraphic position. An artifact without context tells us very little. Another missing component is dating. The game never tries relative or absolute dating. There's no stratigraphy, no discussion of layers, no way to establish a timeline. In real archaeology, relative dating methods like stratigraphy and seriation are essential. Absolute dating methods like radiocarbon dating or dendrochronology allow archaeologists to place sites in time. And without dating, artifacts are disconnected from history. While the oversimplification of all of these archaeological actions is not good for the vision problem, it makes for relatively entertaining gameplay. Looking again at these initial artifacts, they're pretty ambiguously not human bones, and again, tied more into zoo archaeology than what would be osteology. But that's okay. As you unlock new locations, the game introduces different environments and artifact types. And while this adds variety, it still kind of reinforces these unrealistic expectations. The artifacts begin with plausible items like bones, stone tools, stoneware, and these are reasonable artifacts that archaeologists might actually encounter and could potentially tell us about subsistence, technology, or daily life. In the game, artifacts appear to be randomly generated. You can dig up one object, then dig nearby and find nothing related to it. I actually tested this by digging around areas where artifacts appeared and expected to find clusters or associations, but that wasn't the case. In real excavations, artifacts tend to cluster because people used and discarded their objects in certain ways. You might find cooking tools near a hearth or domestic artifacts in living spaces, and random distribution undermines the idea of an archaeological record. As I continued to unlock these new areas, I realized that rather than being like new locales, the main changes in these locations were climates, which would realistically have an effect on the type of artifacts that you find. As the game progressed, the artifacts began to look increasingly unusual. Eventually, we started finding potions and spell books and alchemical tools, and this is where the game crosses into pseudo-archaeology. Pseudo-archaeology involves interpretations of the past that are not supported by evidence and often rely on fantasies, speculation, sensationalism. While the game is clearly fictional, we're starting to see mirrors of real-world pseudo-archaeological narratives, like claims that people practiced magic or had supernatural abilities or received help from mythical beings. The danger of pseudo-archaeology is that it places evidence-based interpretation with fantasy. And in real archaeology, interpretations must be grounded in material evidence and patterns. For example, if archaeologists find repeated ritual objects in a consistent context, they might infer belief systems, but those interpretations are cautious and supported by data. So going into the final areas of the game, we get fully immersed in this fantasy narrative, and we are introduced to this Halloween-themed environment. The artifacts here are explicitly fictional artifacts tied to witches, and the implication is that witches lived here, which is exactly the kind of unsupported narrative archaeologists try to avoid. In real life, archaeologists would interpret these objects as evidence of cultural practices, symbolism, or rituals, and not literal magic. While I expected some pseudo-archaeology going into the game, the presence of it still highlights the vision problem. Games, films, TV are always portraying archaeology as some sort of mysterious, fantastical pursuit. And while that may attract interest, it is ultimately harming the discipline by promoting misunderstandings. These portrayals contribute to looting, destruction of sites, and disrespect towards descendant communities. While the last few set of artifacts are clearly deeply pseudo-archaeological, I will say that the artifact descriptions do resemble what would be considered practical archaeology, which is kind of trying to discern what these artifacts were used for and how they fit into the context of the culture that they're associated with. So from here, I realized most of the cases were full, and I decided that I was more or less done with the game for the purposes of my project. One thing I wanted to point out is real archaeology is heavily regulated. There are laws governing who can excavate, where excavation can happen, and what happens to artifacts after they're recovered. A relevant example is NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was passed in 1990 and requires museums and archaeologists to return human remains and certain cultural items to descendant Native American tribes. Archaeologists also have ethical responsibilities to descendant communities and to the public. Artifacts are not trophies, they are pieces of cultural heritage. Overall, while the game is entertaining, it's not an accurate representation of archaeological practice. It overlooks many key themes, including survey, context, dating, and very specifically ethics, and leans heavily into pseudo-archaeology and creating spectacles. If there's one takeaway I had from this experience, it's that archaeology is not about objects, it's about people. And archaeologists have a responsibility to study the past carefully, respectfully, and ethically, because once the evidence is gone, it's gone forever. The purpose of this project was to engage the public with archaeology in a meaningful way, and even though this was my first ever video and time editing video and recording voiceover, I hope I was able to educate at least a few people on the reality of archaeology and help attack archaeology's vision problem. Thank you.